September 19th, 1944, 0800 hours. Major Karl Bode stands beside his Panther tank in the pre-dawn fog near Arracourt, France, watching his reconnaissance battalion form up for the attack. He is 41 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front, and he has been told by his superiors that this will be easy. The Americans ahead are using Sherman tanks, Shermans with their inadequate armor and their weak 75mm guns, Shermans that any Panther crew can destroy at 2,000 meters. Bode has fought Russians. He has seen T-34s burning across the Ukrainian steppe. He has watched Soviet tank columns advance in human wave attacks, crews barely trained, many without radios, sent forward to die in numbers that would overwhelm through sheer mass. The Americans, he has been assured, are worse. Soft, industrial, men who learn to fight from a manual while Germans learned in blood. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The fog is thick enough that Bode cannot see more than 50 meters. This is good, his commanders say. It will negate American air power. It will allow the Panzers to close the distance before the Shermans can engage. The 113th Panzer Brigade has overwhelming superiority. 45 Panthers, 45 Panzer, Mark IVs against, perhaps, 30 American medium tanks somewhere in the rolling hills ahead. By 1000 hours, Bode's battalion no longer exists as a fighting force. He will suffer a nervous breakdown. A neighboring division will have to set up a straggler line to gather the fleeing Panzer Grenadiers, still being rounded up the next day. The report to General Hasso von Manteuffel will state directly, Hill Triangle lost, troops exhausted, need rest. This is not the story of how the Sherman beat the Panther because of superior technology. The Panther was, on paper, the better tank, better armor, better gun, better range. This is the story of how German officers, schooled in a doctrine that had conquered Poland and France and pushed to the gates of Moscow, discovered that the Americans they faced in Lorraine in the autumn of 1944 were not the Americans they expected, and how that discovery, repeated across dozens of engagements over 3 brutal months, would fundamentally alter German tactical thinking about the Western Allies. The Lorraine campaign has been overshadowed in military history. It lacks the drama of Normandy, the desperation of the Bulge, the symbolism of crossing the Rhine. But for the German officer corps, Lorraine was where their assumptions about American capabilities collided with a reality they were unprepared to accept. To understand what happened in Lorraine, you must first understand what German generals believed about American tank crews in September of 1944. These beliefs were not random prejudices. They were carefully constructed assessments based on doctrine, on intelligence, on their own experiences, and on a conviction that had been reinforced by 6 years of war, that the Wehrmacht's tactical sophistication was unmatched by any army in the world. General der Panzertruppe Hermann Balk took command of Army Group G on September 21st, 1944, in the middle of the Lorraine fighting. Balk was not a Nazi ideologue. He was a professional soldier, arguably one of the finest panzer commanders Germany produced. His battles on the Cheer River in December of 1942 were studied in post-war military academies as masterpieces of mobile warfare. He had fought in France, in Greece, in Russia, in Italy. He knew how to assess an opponent. Balk's arrival in Lorraine was meant to stabilize the front against Patton's Third Army. He brought with him expectations shaped by his Eastern Front experience and by the German General Staff's institutional knowledge of how wars were won. Tank warfare, in German doctrine, was about combined mobility and firepower, about creating Schwerpunkt, about Auftragstactic, mission-type tactics where subordinate commanders had the freedom to exploit opportunities. The Americans, German intelligence suggested, did not fight this way. American doctrine, as the Germans understood it, was methodical, industrial, cautious. American tanks were designed for infantry support, not tank versus tank combat. The Sherman's low-velocity 75mm gun confirmed this assessment. It was optimized for high-explosive rounds against fortifications, not armor-piercing rounds against German panzers. Moreover, The Sherman's design suggested a disturbing lack of seriousness about armored warfare. It was tall, making it an easy target. Its armor was thin, barely adequate against the German 75mm gun, hopeless against the 88. Its mechanical reliability was admirable, but reliability meant nothing if you were burning before you could bring your gun to bear. German officers, in September of 1944, knew these facts. They also knew something else. The Americans had been in sustained combat since Normandy, only 3 months. The Wehrmacht had been at war since 1939. 5 years. 5 years of constant combat, of adapting, of learning. German tank crews might be green replacements by 1944, poorly trained because there was no fuel for practice, but German doctrine was mature, tested, refined in the crucible of total war. This is what Balk believed when he arrived in Lorraine. This is what Manteuffel believed when he ordered the 5th Panzer Army to attack at Arracourt. This is what officers all along the line believed, that whatever advantages the Americans had in numbers and air power and logistics, they lacked the tactical sophistication, the crew coordination, the battlefield instincts that German armor possessed. The Battle of Arracourt, fought between September 18th and 29th, would be the collision point where belief met reality. The terrain around Arracourt was agricultural, gently rolling hills with scattered woods. Not ideal tank country, but workable. The Americans held a thinly defended salient, Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, spread across a wide area. Major General John S. Wood commanded the division. His troops had been in continuous combat since late July, racing across France in Patton's pursuit of the broken German armies fleeing Normandy. They were experienced. They were confident. They had rarely faced determined German armor. The German plan for September 19th was straightforward. The 113th Panzer Brigade would strike from the east and south, penetrate the American outposts, and drive through to Arracourt itself. Speed and mass would overwhelm the dispersed American forces. The fog would conceal the advance until it was too late for the Shermans to establish defensive positions. What happened instead revealed the first of many assumptions that would prove catastrophic. The 113th Panzer Brigade advanced blindly into the fog with no reconnaissance. This was not incompetence. This was necessity. The newly formed Panzer Brigades had no organic reconnaissance units. The pressure to attack immediately to stop Patton's advance before he reached the Rhine meant there was no time for proper preparation. So the panzers advanced into terrain they did not know, against an enemy whose positions they had not located, trusting that their superior tanks and firepower would compensate. The American dispositions were not what the Germans expected. Combat Command A had established an extended outpost line of armored infantry and engineers, supported by tanks, tank destroyers, and artillery, positioned in depth. These were not massed formations, waiting to be discovered and engaged. These were concealed positions on ground the Americans had chosen, with interlocking fields of fire. At 0800 hours, German tanks penetrated the outpost line. Almost immediately, they encountered something their intelligence had not prepared them for. American tank destroyers, M10 Wolverines and M18 Hellcats. These were fast, heavily gunned vehicles designed specifically to kill tanks. They were not locked into fixed positions. They operated in platoons, moving quickly, engaging from hull-down positions, withdrawing before German gunners could acquire them. 2 tank destroyer platoons and a medium tank company engaged the advancing Panthers in a running fight. The Germans had superior armor and superior guns. But the Americans had something the Germans did not expect. They knew where the Germans were. They had chosen the terrain. They had pre-sighted their fields of fire, and when German tanks exposed their thinner side armor, maneuvering through the fog, American gunners were waiting. The fighting extended all the way to Combat Command A's headquarters, where a battalion of M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers, normally used for indirect fire support, took the Panthers under direct fire at point-blank range. 105mm guns designed to lob shells at targets miles away were firing horizontally at German tanks a few hundred meters distant. This was not in any tactical manual. This was desperation. It worked. By mid-morning, the fog began to lift. The Panthers that had penetrated deepest into the American position found themselves exposed, with American Shermans maneuvering to their flanks. The Shermans could not penetrate a Panther's frontal armor. Every American tanker knew this, but a Panther's side armor was vulnerable. And the Sherman's faster turret traverse, its better visibility, its crew coordination, meant that in close combat, at ranges where the Panther's superior gun was no advantage, American crews could get into position and fire first. 11 Panzers were knocked out that morning. The 113th Panzer Brigade withdrew to regroup. German commanders, monitoring radio reports, tried to make sense of what had happened. The Americans should not have been ready. The Americans should not have been able to coordinate tank destroyers, artillery, and tanks in such depth. The Americans should not have fought with such tactical flexibility. Manteuffel ordered the attack to continue. Fresh units were committed. The 111th Panzer Brigade, the understrength 11th Panzer Division. Over the next 10 days, German forces launched repeated assaults against the Arracourt position. Each attack followed the same basic plan: mass the Panzers, exploit firepower superiority, overwhelm the Americans through shock and violence. Each attack failed. On September 20th, the 11th Panzer Division attacked again. American forces had reinforced during the night. Additional tanks, additional infantry, additional artillery. More critically, the Americans had learned from the previous day's fighting. They knew now where the Germans would come from. They had adjusted their positions. When the Panzers advanced, they advanced into a prepared defense. The Germans had one advantage that morning: continued fog. Air support, the American trump card, was grounded. But the fog that protected German tanks from P-47 Thunderbolts also negated the range advantage of their guns. Combat devolved into close-range engagements. In the mist, tank against tank, at distances measured in hundreds of meters. In these conditions, the Sherman's advantages emerged. It was faster. Its suspension handled the rolling terrain better. Its turret traversed more quickly. Its crews, 5 men working in practiced coordination, could acquire targets and fire faster than German crews, still learning to work together in tanks they had received weeks before. But the real American advantage was something harder to quantify. It was the coordination between arms. Every German attack ran into the same problem: American artillery. When German tanks massed for an assault, American forward observers called in fire missions. 105mm and 155mm shells rained down on assembly areas. German formations broke apart before they reached the American positions. The surviving tanks that did close with the enemy found themselves engaging not just Shermans, but tank destroyers, positioned on their flanks, infantry with bazookas in the woods, more artillery, walking fire across their positions. This was combined arms warfare. The Germans had invented it. They had used it to devastating effect in Poland, in France, in Russia. But by September of 1944, on the Western Front, the Americans were executing it better. On September 22nd, weather finally cleared. The P-47s of the 19th Tactical Air Command launched sortie after sortie against German armor. Panthers, caught in open fields, massing for attacks, became priority targets. Fighter bombers strafed and bombed. The tank battles on the ground continued, but now every German movement was observed from the air, reported, targeted. The effectiveness of American air support was not just about destroying tanks, it was about disrupting German operations. Commanders could not mass forces without being spotted. Supply columns could not move forward. Communications broke down as radio operators spent more time calling for air cover than coordinating attacks. The psychological effect on German crews was profound. Men who had learned to fight on the Eastern Front, where the Luftwaffe at least contested the skies, now operated in an environment of total Allied air superiority. By September 25th, the 5th Panzer Army's offensive had stalled. The 111th Panzer Brigade and the 11th Panzer Division were crippled as cohesive combat units. The Germans had lost decisively. More than that, they had lost in a way that challenged every assumption German commanders held about American tactical abilities. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The casualty figures told part of the story. Combat Command A had lost 14 M4 Sherman medium tanks and 7 M5 light tanks destroyed, with 25 killed and 88 wounded. German losses were much harder to determine precisely, but the 4th Armored Division claimed 281 German tanks destroyed during the entire Lorraine campaign, with thousands of Germans killed or captured. The 113th Panzer Brigade, which began the battle with 45 Panthers, was effectively destroyed as a fighting unit, but the numbers did not capture what had really happened. The numbers did not explain why veteran German tank commanders, men who had fought across Russia, were now shaken. The numbers did not explain the reports filtering back to Army Group G headquarters, reports that described American tank crews fighting with a level of coordination and tactical awareness that contradicted everything German intelligence had said about them. Major Karl Bode's nervous breakdown was not an anomaly, it was a symptom. The psychological strain of fighting an enemy who was supposed to be inferior, but was demonstrably not, of watching Panthers burn despite their superior armor and guns, of seeing American formations appear where they should not be, respond faster than they should be able to, coordinate artillery and air and armor in ways that suggested not just competence, but genuine tactical sophistication. Hermann Balk, watching the battle unfold from Army Group G headquarters, tried to make sense of the disaster. His initial assessment, shaped by his experiences on the Eastern Front, had been that the Americans would crack under pressure, that their industrial approach to war, their reliance on material superiority, would falter when faced with German tactical excellence. Arracourt suggested otherwise. Balk was pragmatic enough to adjust his understanding. In the weeks that followed, as Third Army continued operations across Lorraine, as American forces fought to capture Metz and push toward the German border, Balk began to reassess American capabilities. He would later admit in post-war interviews that he had underestimated the quality of American tank crews and the effectiveness of American combined arms doctrine. This reassessment came at a cost. Army Group G continued to fight through October, November, December. The Lorraine campaign was grinding, brutal, marked by heavy casualties on both sides and slow American progress through terrible weather and determined German resistance. But the nature of German resistance changed. The confident expectation that American armor could be easily defeated in tank versus tank combat gave way to a more cautious approach. German commanders began fighting defensively, using terrain and prepared positions, avoiding the kind of mobile counterattacks that had characterized the early days of Arracourt. This shift in German tactics was an admission. The Americans were not the soft, poorly trained enemy that German intelligence had described. They were competent. They were well coordinated. They were learning and adapting at a pace that matched or exceeded the Wehrmacht's own adaptation. The specific lessons of Arracourt rippled through the German command structure. Reports noted American proficiency in reconnaissance, their use of terrain, their integration of artillery fires, their air-ground coordination. German officers who had dismissed the Sherman as inferior began noting with grudging respect the tactical skill of Sherman crews. The tank itself had not changed. What had changed was German recognition that the men inside those tanks were not amateurs. One report from a German division commander in late September noted that American tank platoons operated with a level of independence and initiative that was supposed to be the hallmark of German Auftragstactic. American crews did not wait for orders. They identified opportunities and exploited them. They worked together, covering each other, maneuvering in coordination. Another report from October described American use of combined arms. The enemy coordinates his tanks, artillery, and air power with a precision that makes isolated attacks impossible. Any attempt to mass forces for a counterattack is immediately met with artillery fire and airstrikes. Their tank crews fight from prepared positions with artillery pre-sighted and infantry support immediately available. These were not the observations of men fighting an inferior opponent. These were the observations of men recognizing, with growing unease, that they were facing an enemy who had mastered the same combined arms doctrine that had once been Germany's exclusive advantage. The psychological impact of this recognition cannot be overstated. The German army, in September of 1944, was already reeling from the catastrophic defeats in Normandy and on the Eastern Front. Morale was sustained in part by the belief in German tactical superiority. If German soldiers and equipment were outnumbered, if logistics were failing, if air superiority was lost, at least German tactical excellence remained. The certainty that man for man, unit for unit, the Wehrmacht could outfight any opponent. Lorraine challenged that certainty, not everywhere, not all at once. The campaign was too complex for simple narratives. There were engagements where German forces fought brilliantly, where American attacks were repulsed, where panthers and tigers dominated the battlefield. But the consistent pattern, repeated across hundreds of engagements, was that American tank crews were not the weak link German commanders had expected. They were tough, competent, and increasingly skilled opponents. By October, German intelligence assessments began to change. Earlier reports had emphasized American material superiority and downplayed American tactical abilities. October reports acknowledged that enemy tank crews demonstrate high levels of training and coordination. November reports noted that the quality of American armored units has significantly improved since Normandy. This was partially true. American units had gained experience. 4th Armored Division crews in September were veterans of 3 months of combat. They had learned in Normandy's bocage, in the pursuit across France, in the early battles of Lorraine. They had adapted, discarding tactics that did not work, refining techniques that did, but the improvement German reports documented was not just about American learning. It was also about German recognition. The Americans had not suddenly become better tankers in September. They had been competent all along. What had changed was that German commanders were now forced to acknowledge that competence. Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army during Arracourt, would spend only a short time in Lorraine before being transferred to prepare for the Ardennes offensive. His experiences at Arracourt would shape his thinking during the Battle of the Bulge. Manteuffel understood, better than many German commanders, that underestimating American combat effectiveness was a fatal error. In post-war interviews, Manteuffel was careful in his assessments. He acknowledged that American tank crews in late 1944 were well-trained and capable. He noted their proficiency in reconnaissance, their coordination with artillery and air support, their effective use of terrain. These were not grudging admissions. These were professional assessments from a commander who had learned to respect his opponent. What Manteuffel did not say, but what the battle record demonstrated, was that by the autumn of 1944, American tank crews had closed the experience gap that had existed in Normandy. They had not become German crews. They fought differently, within a different doctrinal framework, supported by advantages in logistics and air power that German forces could only envy. But within their own framework, they had achieved mastery. This is the story that emerges from Lorraine. Not a story of Sherman superiority over Panther, because the Panther remained the better tank on paper. Not a story of American tactical doctrine overwhelming German doctrine, because both doctrines had strengths and weaknesses, but a story of American tank crews proving in battle after battle that they were the equals of their German counterparts in the skills that mattered: crew coordination, tactical awareness, adaptability, and the will to close with and destroy the enemy. For German generals, this realization was profound. It meant that the one advantage Germany retained, tactical excellence, was no longer exclusive. It meant that the Wehrmacht would have to fight the rest of the war not as a superior force held back by material disadvantage, but as an increasingly desperate force facing opponents who matched them in skill and far exceeded them in resources. The full implications of Lorraine would become clear only later, in the fighting ahead. But for officers like Balk and Manteuffel, the lessons were immediate and unmistakable. The Americans they faced in Lorraine were not the Americans of their pre-war imagination or their intelligence briefings. They were professional soldiers fighting within a mature combined arms system, and they were getting better. The reassessment that began at Arracourt would continue through the autumn of 1944 as Third Army pressed eastward toward the German border. The fighting in Lorraine did not end in September. It intensified through October and November, becoming a grinding, attritional campaign that tested both armies to their limits. For German commanders, each engagement added new data points to their evolving understanding of American capabilities. The picture that emerged was more nuanced than the simple narrative of German tactical superiority meeting American industrial might. What German officers discovered was that they were fighting an opponent whose doctrine, training, and execution had matured rapidly under the pressure of sustained combat. General Hermann Balk's tenure commanding Army Group G through the autumn of 1944 gave him an extended opportunity to observe American operations. Unlike many German commanders who encountered American forces only briefly before being transferred or killed, Balk spent months fighting Third Army across Lorraine. His post-war writings and interviews provide some of the most detailed German assessments of American tactical capabilities during this period. Balk noted several specific American strengths that contradicted German preconceptions. First, American reconnaissance was far better than expected. German doctrine emphasized reconnaissance, the careful gathering of intelligence before committing forces. German commanders assumed the Americans, with their preference for methodical advances, would be weak in this area. Instead, Balk found that American units consistently demonstrated good knowledge of German positions and movements. This was not accidental. American armored divisions had developed effective reconnaissance doctrines during the pursuit across France. Cavalry reconnaissance squadrons, equipped with light tanks and armored cars, screened ahead of main forces. Infantry patrols probed German positions. Artillery forward observers maintained constant surveillance. Most critically, American air reconnaissance provided information that German ground commanders could no longer obtain because the Luftwaffe had been swept from the skies. Balk observed that American commanders at battalion and company level showed increasing initiative and tactical flexibility. This contradicted the German stereotype of American officers as rigid followers of doctrine. In reality, American junior officers in late 1944 had months of combat experience. They had learned, as German officers had learned in earlier campaigns, how to read terrain, how to exploit opportunities, how to coordinate their units in fluid situations. Second, Balk noted American proficiency in combined arms coordination. This was perhaps the most significant German discovery in Lorraine. Combined arms, the integration of infantry, armor, artillery, and air power into mutually supporting operations, was supposed to be a German strength developed over years of warfare. The Americans had been in combat less than 6 months. They should not have been able to match German coordination. Yet in engagement, after engagement, German units found themselves facing coordinated American responses. When German tanks attacked, American artillery fire disrupted the assault before it reached the objective. When German infantry tried to infiltrate American positions, American tank infantry teams counterattacked in coordination. When German forces tried to mass for operations, American airstrikes broke up the formations. This coordination was not simply a matter of having more artillery shells or more aircraft. It was about timing, communication, and practice. American forward observers knew how to call fires quickly. American air liaison officers embedded with ground units could direct close air support with precision. American tank and infantry platoons had trained together and learned to support each other in combat. Balk recognized that the Americans had developed, through combat experience, the same kind of combined arms proficiency that German doctrine theoretically emphasized, but that German units in 1944 could rarely execute effectively. Germany's personnel losses fuel shortages, and training deficiencies meant that the theoretical excellence of Wehrmacht doctrine was increasingly divorced from battlefield reality. American units, by contrast, had the resources to train, the fuel to practice, and the replacements to maintain unit cohesion. Third, Balk observed American adaptability. German doctrine prized flexibility and initiative, the concept of off-track tactic, where subordinate commanders were given missions and allowed to determine how to accomplish them. The Americans were supposed to be methodical and rigid, locked into procedures that could not adapt to changing circumstances. Instead, Balk found that American units learned quickly from each engagement and modified their tactics accordingly. After the early battles around Arracourt, American tank units adjusted their deployments to better defend against German counterattacks. American artillery refined its techniques for breaking up German armored formations. American infantry improved its coordination with tanks when clearing villages and fighting in close terrain. This adaptability was systematic. American units conducted after-action reviews, disseminated lessons learned, and modified their standard operating procedures. The institutional mechanisms for learning, which the U.S. Army had developed during peacetime training, proved effective in combat. Units got better, not just through experience, but through deliberate analysis and adaptation. The contrast with German forces in late 1944 was stark. Wehrmacht units that had once been highly adaptive were now struggling simply to maintain cohesion. Replacement crews had minimal training. Units were being broken up and reformed constantly as the personnel situation deteriorated. The flexibility that had characterized German operations in earlier years was giving way to desperation and improvisation. Beyond these specific tactical observations, Balk recognized something more fundamental about American tank crews. They had confidence. This might seem like an intangible quality, difficult to measure or quantify, but on the battlefield, confidence manifests in observable behaviors. Confident crews maneuver aggressively. They take calculated risks. They press attacks when they gain an advantage. They do not panic when faced with superior enemy equipment. American Sherman crews in Lorraine demonstrated this confidence consistently. They knew their tanks were outgunned by Panthers and Tigers. They knew their armor was inadequate against German 88mm guns. But they also knew they could win through superior coordination, better support, and tactical skill. This confidence was not bravado. It was the product of experience, training, and repeated success. German intelligence reports from October and November 1944 increasingly reflected this reassessment. One report from the 11th Panzer Division noted that enemy tank crews fight with determination and skill. They cannot be relied upon to retreat when faced with superior German armor. Engagements must be planned on the assumption that American tanks will fight effectively. Another report from the First Army fighting to the north of Lorraine observed that the quality of American armored units continues to improve. Their coordination of armor, artillery, and air support is excellent. Attempts to engage American tanks in isolation invariably result in engagement with supporting elements. These assessments filtered up through the German command structure. By late October, when Hitler was planning the Ardennes offensive, German generals had a more realistic understanding of what they would face when attacking American forces in the West. This understanding influenced planning for the Battle of the Bulge. German commanders knew they could not count on American forces collapsing under pressure. They knew American tank units would fight effectively. They planned accordingly, emphasizing speed and surprise, rather than assuming tactical superiority alone would carry the offensive. The specific lessons about American tank crews that emerged from Lorraine can be summarized in several key points that recur in German reports and post-war accounts. American crews were well trained in basic tank operations. German reports noted that American tankers demonstrated proficiency in gunnery, driving, and crew coordination. This might seem obvious, but it contradicted earlier German intelligence that suggested American training was superficial. In reality, U.S. Army armored training, conducted at facilities like Fort Knox, was comprehensive and effective. Crews arrived in combat units with solid foundational skills. American platoon and company formations operated cohesively. German observers noted that American tanks maneuvered in coordination, covering each other, working together to overwhelm German positions. This was not the mass attack of poorly coordinated vehicles that German officers had seen on the Eastern Front. This was practiced combined movement within small units. American tank infantry coordination was effective. German reports consistently mentioned that American tanks rarely operated without infantry support and that infantry and armor worked together smoothly. This was a doctrinal emphasis in U.S. armored divisions, where armored infantry battalions were trained to fight alongside tank battalions. The execution of this doctrine in Lorraine demonstrated that American units had internalized these practices. American use of terrain showed tactical understanding. German officers noted that American crews used hull-down positions effectively, chose firing positions with good fields of fire and cover, and maneuvered to gain advantageous positions. These were the fundamentals of armored warfare, and American crews demonstrated mastery of them. American fire discipline was good. Rather than firing wildly, American gunners took aimed shots and achieved reasonable hit rates. This was crucial in Sherman versus Panther engagements, where American crews needed to target vulnerable spots on German tanks. The training American gunners received, combined with the Sherman's superior gun stabilization and optics compared to earlier American tanks, made them effective even against better armored opponents. American radio discipline and communication were excellent. German reports noted, often with frustration, that American units maintained good radio communication and coordinated their actions effectively. This was a significant advantage. German tactical doctrine assumed good communications, but by late 1944, German communications in the field were often degraded by equipment shortages and jamming. American forces, by contrast, had reliable radios in every tank and maintained effective nets. These observations, accumulated over dozens of engagements across Lorraine, forced German commanders to fundamentally revise their assessment of American armored forces. The Americans were not amateurs who could be easily defeated through German tactical superiority. They were competent professionals who had learned their trade in combat and who operated within a system that amplified their effectiveness. This recognition had practical consequences for how German forces fought. Commanders became more cautious about engaging American armor. Plans that relied on German tanks simply overwhelming American positions through superior combat power were abandoned. German forces increasingly fought defensively, using prepared positions and terrain to offset American advantages in numbers and support. The psychological impact on German tank crews was significant. Men who had been told they were fighting in superior tanks against inferior opponents now faced the reality that American crews could and would kill them. The confidence that had sustained German panzer troops through years of combat began to erode. Veterans of the Eastern Front, where German tactical superiority had been taken for granted despite Soviet numerical advantages, found themselves questioning their own survivability on the Western Front. This erosion of confidence was compounded by the overwhelming American material advantages. German crews knew that if they knocked out one Sherman, two more would appear. They knew that American tanks they destroyed would be replaced within days, while German losses were permanent. They knew that the sky belonged to the Americans, that supply lines were constantly under attack, that fuel and ammunition were becoming scarce. But beyond these material factors, there was the growing recognition that the Americans they faced were skilled opponents who would exploit any German mistake. This changed the character of combat. Engagements became more cautious, more calculated. The aggressive counterattacks that had characterized German armored operations in earlier years gave way to defensive fighting aimed at survival rather than victory. For individual German tank commanders, the experience of fighting American armor in Lorraine was often traumatic. Officers who had built their confidence on years of success against enemies they viewed as inferior were now facing opponents who matched or exceeded their capabilities. The psychological stress of this reversal, combined with the physical exhaustion of constant combat and the declining fortunes of the German military overall, created a sense of futility that infected entire units. Major Karl Bode's nervous breakdown after Arracourt was not unique. German medical records from the autumn of 1944 show increasing rates of combat stress casualties among armored units. Part of this was simply the grinding nature of defensive warfare, but part was the psychological shock of discovering that assumptions about German superiority were no longer valid. The broader strategic implications of Lorraine were profound. If German forces could not achieve tactical superiority over American armor, then Germany's entire strategic position in the West was untenable. The Wehrmacht's only hope of avoiding defeat had been to inflict disproportionate casualties on Allied forces, making the cost of victory unacceptable to the democracies. This strategy depended on German tactical excellence compensating for Allied material superiority. Lorraine demonstrated that this calculation was flawed. American forces were not suffering disproportionate casualties. In tank versus tank combat, the Americans were winning more often than they were losing. When material advantages in artillery, air power, and logistics were factored in, the exchange ratios were heavily in favor of the Americans. German commanders understood these implications. Hermann Balk, in his post-war writings, acknowledged that by late 1944, Germany had lost not just material superiority, but tactical parity. The Wehrmacht was being outfought as well as outnumbered. This recognition informed his increasingly pessimistic assessments of Germany's strategic situation. Hasso von Manteuffel, reflecting on his experiences at Arracourt and later in the Ardennes, noted that German planning had consistently underestimated American capabilities. He argued that this underestimation stemmed from a combination of wishful thinking, poor intelligence, and ideological prejudice. German officers wanted to believe the Americans were inferior because the alternative was too grim to accept. This wishful thinking extended beyond assessments of American tank crews. It affected German understanding of American logistics, American air power, American artillery, and American industrial capacity. The narrative German commanders told themselves was that Germany's tactical excellence would prevail against America's quantitative advantages. Lorraine shattered that narrative. The German general's reassessment of American tank crews was part of a larger, more painful recognition that Germany was losing the war not just because it was outnumbered, but because it was being outfought. This recognition came too late to change Germany's strategic trajectory. By the autumn of 1944, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. But the recognition itself is historically significant because it marks the moment when German military professionals, arguably among the most competent practitioners of warfare in modern history, acknowledged that their opponents in the West had achieved tactical parity. The specific case of American Sherman crews is illustrative of this broader pattern. In September 1944, German commanders expected to dominate tank engagements through superior equipment and tactics. By December, those same commanders knew that American tank crews were dangerous opponents who could not be underestimated. This shift in perception, documented in intelligence reports, operational orders, and post-war interviews, represents a fundamental revision of how German generals understood their American adversaries. It is worth emphasizing that this reassessment did not mean German commanders suddenly believed American forces were superior. The recognition was more subtle. German officers acknowledged that Americans were competent, that they fought within an effective combined arms system, and that their tactical execution was good enough to negate Germany's traditional advantages. This was not admiration. It was professional respect, born of hard experience. The fighting in Lorraine continued through November and into December. Third Army's advance slowed as weather deteriorated and German resistance stiffened. The battles around Metz and in the Saar region were brutal, attritional affairs where neither side could achieve decisive advantage. American forces made progress, but slowly and at significant cost. For German forces, this slow, grinding combat was preferable to the mobile warfare of earlier in the autumn. In defensive fighting, German advantages in terrain and fortifications could partially offset American superiority in numbers and firepower. German tank crews, fighting from prepared positions, could use their superior guns to engage American armor at range. The wild, fluid tank battles of Arracourt gave way to more controlled engagements where German forces had time to prepare. But even in these conditions, German commanders remained wary of American capabilities. Orders from this period emphasized the need for thorough reconnaissance, for coordinating armor with anti-tank guns and infantry, for avoiding exposed positions where American artillery or air power could target German tanks. The confidence that had characterized German operational orders earlier in the war was gone, replaced by caution and defensive-mindedness. By early December, when planning for the Ardennes offensive was finalized, German commanders knew they would be attacking American forces that were tactically competent and well supported. The plan for the offensive reflected this knowledge. Rather than relying on German tactical superiority to overwhelm American defenses, the plan emphasized surprise, poor weather to negate American air power, and rapid advances to seize key objectives before American forces could organize coherent resistance. The role of tank forces in the Ardennes plan also reflected lessons from Lorraine. German armor would not be used for frontal assaults against prepared American positions. Instead, panzer divisions would exploit breakthroughs achieved by infantry, moving rapidly through gaps in American lines, bypassing strongpoints, seizing bridges and road junctions before American reinforcements could arrive. This was mobile warfare in the classic German style, but adapted to account for American capabilities. The Ardennes offensive itself falls outside the scope of this narrative, but it is worth noting that German experiences in the Bulge reinforced the assessments that had emerged from Lorraine. American forces, after initial surprise and dislocation, responded effectively. American tank crews fought tenaciously. American combined arms coordination, once units recovered from the initial shock, proved as effective in the Ardennes as it had been in Lorraine. The ultimate failure of the Ardennes offensive, which exhausted Germany's last strategic reserves and hastened the final collapse of the Third Reich, was overdetermined by many factors. But among those factors was the reality that German forces could no longer achieve the kind of tactical dominance that had characterized their earlier campaigns. American forces had closed the gap in tactical proficiency. German material disadvantages could no longer be offset by superior skill. For the purpose of understanding what German generals thought about American Sherman crews after Lorraine, the key point is simple. They thought those crews were effective, competent, and dangerous. This was not the assessment German commanders had expected to make. It was the assessment forced upon them by the evidence of battle. German reports from late 1944 consistently acknowledge American proficiency. A December intelligence summary from Army Group G noted, American armored units demonstrate consistently high levels of training and coordination. Tank crews are skilled in gunnery and maneuver. Integration of armor with infantry, artillery, and air support is excellent. American forces cannot be expected to collapse under pressure and must be assumed to fight effectively in all circumstances. This assessment, dry and professional in its language, represented a revolution in German thinking. 6 months earlier, German commanders had viewed American forces with contempt or, at best, condescension. Now, they were writing intelligence summaries that described Americans as skilled, effective, and dangerous. The personal accounts of German tank commanders who fought in Lorraine reflect this shift. In post-war interviews and memoirs, veterans described their surprise at American effectiveness, their respect for American coordination, and their growing fear of the American system of warfare that could bring overwhelming force to bear at any point. One Panzer commander who fought at Arracourt recalled, "We expected that our Panthers would dominate the Shermans. In technical specifications, this was true. But the Americans did not fight as individuals. They fought as a system. When you engaged one Sherman, you were engaged by artillery, by airstrikes, by more tanks appearing on your flanks. The Sherman itself was vulnerable, but the American way of fighting made each tank part of something larger and more dangerous." Another veteran described the psychological impact. On the Eastern Front, we knew we could outfight the Russians. We might lose because of their numbers, but tank against tank, crew against crew, we were superior. Against the Americans, we did not have that certainty. They were well-trained, they coordinated, they did not make the mistakes we counted on enemies making. This was frightening in a different way than Russian mass attacks. It meant we had no margin for error. These personal recollections complement the official German assessments. Together, they paint a picture of an army that had been forced to fundamentally revise its understanding of its opponent. The Americans were not the soft, poorly trained enemy of German preconceptions. They were professional soldiers fighting within an effective system, and by the autumn of 1944, they had become very good at their profession. The specific case of Sherman tank crews illustrates this broader pattern. The Sherman was not a better tank than the Panther or Tiger. In direct comparison of armor, firepower, and mobility, the German tanks were superior. But warfare is not conducted through direct comparisons in laboratory conditions. It is conducted by human beings operating complex machines within elaborate organizational systems under conditions of fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty. In those conditions, the advantages of the Sherman began to matter. Its reliability meant it was more likely to reach the battlefield. Its ergonomics meant its crew could operate effectively for longer periods. Its gun stabilization meant it could fire accurately while moving. Its radio meant it could coordinate with other tanks. Its integration into an effective combined arms system meant it was never fighting alone. Most importantly, the men inside those Shermans were trained, experienced, and confident. They had learned their trade in the bocage of Normandy, refined their skills in the pursuit across France, and proven their competence in the battles of Lorraine. By September 1944, they were veterans, as skilled in their profession as any tank crews in the world. German generals, observing these crews in action, were forced to acknowledge this competence. The acknowledgement came reluctantly, grudgingly, often expressed in language that still tried to preserve some notion of German superiority. But it came. In intelligence reports, in operational assessments, in post-war accounts, German officers admitted that American tank crews were effective opponents who could not be underestimated. This admission matters because it reveals something important about the nature of military effectiveness. The German army of World War II is often held up as an example of tactical excellence, an army that was able to achieve remarkable results despite being outnumbered and outproduced. The story of Lorraine suggests that this excellence, while real in earlier years of the war, had eroded by late 1944. More importantly, it suggests that American forces, often portrayed as winning through material advantage alone, had developed their own tactical excellence. The American way of war in 1944 emphasized system over individual excellence, coordination over individual heroics, material advantage amplified by tactical competence. This was not the German model of warfare, with its emphasis on individual initiative and tactical brilliance, but it was effective. In Lorraine, it proved more effective than the German model executed by an exhausted, under-resourced Wehrmacht. For American Sherman crews, Lorraine was a vindication. They had fought against German armor under difficult conditions, against tanks that on paper should have dominated them, and they had won, not through luck, not through overwhelming numbers alone, but through skill, coordination, and determination. The battles of Lorraine proved that American tank crews could fight and win against the best the Germans could field. For German generals, Lorraine was a revelation and a defeat. A revelation because it forced them to recognize capabilities in their opponent they had not expected. A defeat because this recognition undermined one of the last pillars of German confidence, the belief in their own tactical superiority. If German panzer divisions could not defeat American armored divisions, then Germany's strategic position was hopeless. The reassessment of American capabilities that began at Arracourt continued through the remainder of the war. As American forces crossed the Rhine and drove into Germany, as they encountered and defeated German forces in battle after battle, German commanders' respect for their opponents only grew. By April 1945, when Germany collapsed, German generals had a clear understanding of what they faced: professional, competent, well-equipped armies that had mastered modern warfare. This understanding came too late to change the outcome, but it represents an important historical corrective to narratives that portray the German Wehrmacht as tactically superior to its opponents throughout the war. By late 1944, American forces had closed the tactical gap. The Sherman crews who fought in Lorraine were not inferior to their German counterparts. They were equals, fighting within a system that amplified their effectiveness and made them more dangerous than German commanders had believed possible. The story of what German generals thought about American Sherman crews after Lorraine is ultimately a story about the maturation of the American military in World War II. It is about how an army that began the war unprepared, learned and adapted with remarkable speed. It is about how American tank crews, operating equipment that was good enough rather than best in class, developed the skills and confidence to defeat an opponent that had been considered the world's finest practitioners of armored warfare. And it is about how German generals, facing defeat, were forced to acknowledge that the outcome of the war was not simply determined by material factors. The Allies were winning because they were fighting well, because their soldiers and crews and commanders had become skilled at their profession. This acknowledgement, documented in the German military record and post-war accounts, stands as testament to the effectiveness of American arms in World War II and specifically to the competence of the men who crewed the Sherman tanks that helped win that war. The fog that had covered the fields around Arracourt on September 19, 1944, had lifted by mid-morning. In the days and weeks that followed, as the fighting continued across Lorraine, another kind of fog lifted as well. The fog of German misconceptions about their American opponents. What German generals saw when that fog cleared was an opponent they had not expected and were not prepared to face. Professional, competent, and effective American tank crews who had learned their trade and mastered their profession. That recognition, forced upon German commanders by the evidence of battle, represents one of the significant but underappreciated turning points of the Second World War. Not a turning point in the sense of changing the war's outcome, which by September 1944 was already determined, but a turning point in understanding. The moment when Germany's military professionals acknowledged, however reluctantly, that the Americans had become warriors worthy of respect. For the men who crewed the Shermans in Lorraine, that respect was earned through months of training, weeks of combat, and countless individual acts of skill and courage. They fought in tanks they knew were outgunned. They faced opponents they knew were experienced, and they won, not through any single advantage, but through the accumulation of small superiorities in crew coordination, tactical awareness, combined arms integration, and sheer determination. This is their story. This is what German generals learned about American Sherman crews after Lorraine, that they were, in every way that mattered in combat, the equals of any tank crews in the world. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.